Hello and welcome to the Weekly Takeaway, what you need to know from the news. Again, another big news week. There are always things going on, as I'm sure you're aware. But before we jump into the big stories of the week, I want to remind you, if you have not yet subscribed, please do that. I hope that you're appreciating the content that we're putting out, but you're going to miss it if you don't subscribe. You'll also miss it if you don't hit that notification bell. We want you to know when new content comes online, not just this show, but a lot of the other shows and a lot of the other content that we push out. And the very best way for that to happen is for you to hit that notification bell. Please take some time to do that. Also, share this content out, get it to folks who may benefit from it, and we hope that this will be the kind of content that you can take and use in your life. As we've mentioned before, we're not doing this just to retell the stories of the week, although we try to retell some of the stories of the week. We do this to give you the information you need to know to take those stories and apply those to your life and the lives of those in your family and in your circle, your world. And I trust that this will be that for you. So take it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, like, and share it out, and we'll continue to produce content just like this. So again, a lot of things happening in the world today. There are some really big stories, really two that are dominating the news everywhere right now: the coronavirus story and the Democratic nominating process for the general election coming up. Those are the big stories in the news, but there are some other things happening. One of the big stories, at least for me this week, happened just earlier in the week, was the attempted passage in the Senate of the Born Alive bill. This bill would have mandated that healthcare professionals who are performing abortions provide life-saving care to a child that's born alive in the process of an abortion procedure. This happens probably more than you would know. Many folks are born alive after an abortion attempt, and then they are cared for. They're found into either a family or an adoptive situation. All that goes along with that. Again, a big process, as you can imagine. This happens several times, many times a year. This bill, however, that would ensure that kind of care and the process that follows that care was shot down in the Senate. It is crazy to me. So what we have said, our legislators have said, is that life-saving care for a human being born alive is no longer necessary because they were born alive as the parents and the medical professionals were trying to abort them. Regardless of what side of the aisle you might find yourself on, regardless of what you may think about abortion, it's amazing to me that, number one, we're even having a conversation about this. The fact that this is even something that is being talked about, something that was voted on in the Senate, should be mind-blowing to you as an American. It certainly is to me. But then the fact that it was not even able to pass the Senate is incredible as well. What an amazing thing for a country that prides itself on the very fundamental principles of the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We say that we hang on to these things, that we believe in these things, and yet through the process of abortion, we deny those inalienable rights to the least of these, to those who are the most vulnerable in our society, the unborn, the preborn, and now even the born. Not too long ago, we were talking about the passage of the abortion bill in the state of New York that allowed abortion up to the point of birth. What an incredible thing that was. And we said, man, there's nowhere to go from here. This is where you go from there. To say that a child can be left to die after an attempted abortion really is nothing more or less than infanticide. As we look at these things, again, what is the takeaway on that, other than just being heartbroken and sad that we live in a country that would have these discussions and where legislatures would allow this to happen? The takeaway for me is that at some point, Americans need to stand up and say, we're not going to allow this to happen anymore, that this is not okay. So how do we stop it? We make sure that we put legislatures in place. We put representatives in place. We put government officials in place who represent us not only on an economic front or on many of these other political issues, but on this very important life issue. The right to life is a right that we all have. And we've fought the abortion issue on so many different fronts, but we have to say at some point, enough is enough. And I think this last measure illustrates that the conversation is not really about when does life begin. We have been told that that's what this is about. That's not what this is about. This is about individuals saying, I don't care about anyone else. I'm going to do what I want to do, and the government needs to protect my right, even to take life if that's what's necessary. Your takeaway, my takeaway should be, we're going to stand up and say, not anymore, and put people in place who will defend the rights of not only the unborn and the preborn, but the born. This is a big, big deal. And interestingly, this story was lost in the mix of other big news this week. What a tragic, tragic thing where we miss stories like this. A couple of other things happened this week. The Supreme Court is in session and they hear a number of cases every year. And boy, some big ones. One of the biggest ones is one that our president has been fighting for a long time. And he has put in place some measures related to immigration. And these things have gone through the courts. Many federal courts have even stopped the process that the president put in place from going forward. The Supreme Court ruled on those things and said, among other things, that the administration has the right to withhold federal funds from those cities that would call themselves sanctuary cities, those cities across the country that have proclaimed that they will not enforce immigration laws. Again, crazy and kind of upside down. But the president has long said, if you don't want to enforce federal law, then we will withhold federal funds. And there's been a fight over that. The Supreme Court said, no, the administration can withhold federal funds from those cities and really even states now that have said, they're not going to enforce federal law. This makes sense to many of us. In addition to that, we have been told that an immigrant coming into our country doesn't need to have any means of taking care of themselves. If they can get across the border, we, the taxpayers, will take care of them. Several countries around the world, many countries around the world, require that an individual immigrating to their country can demonstrate their economic viability. What does that mean? It means that they can take care of themselves financially so that they don't become a financial burden to the country that they're moving into. This is standard practice in countries around the world. It has not been in the United States. The president, as part of his economic, or rather immigration policy, has said he would like for this to be one of the factors that is considered when determining whether or not an immigrant from another country can come into the United States. Which most of us would say that's common sense. Many have been against it. The Supreme Court, along with some of their other rulings, said that the administration, not the president, but the administration has the right to institute a policy that requires those who are coming into the United States from other countries to live, not to visit, but to live, that they can demonstrate that they are economically viable, that they can pay their way. And this is a big win for many folks who support the immigration policies of this current administration, and something that a lot of other folks, those who would be more open borders, would be against. There are a lot of takeaways here, many other aspects of this that came out of the Supreme Court decision. But there are a lot of things to take away and a lot of things to consider. I think one of the big things we need to consider as we look at all of these things is that those who live in the United States, those who even govern in the United States, these mayors and state governors who have said they're not going to support the federal laws, and those coming into the United States. Each one of these groups of people need to understand that the United States is a country of laws. It's a country of order. And the way to change those laws is to vote. The way to change those laws is to change our legislators. The way to change those laws is to get involved in the process, and we have a very clear process for allowing that to happen. That's one of the great things about being an American. We have a voice in how we're governed. But there are those that would seek to bypass those laws because they don't like them. Now, we have a word for people who bypass the law because they don't like them. We call those people criminals in just about every other setting. But when it comes to immigration, when it comes to some of these other issues, we seem to be confused about how this works. And the takeaway for me is that I'm thankful I live in a country of laws and a country of order. But I also understand that if I come to the point, at any point, where I don't like the laws, and I don't like the things that have been imposed on me, I have the right as a citizen to speak up and to act out by voting my conscience. And the president certainly has pushed through his agenda. The Supreme Court has ruled on that. The fact that we don't need to give money to those that are disregarding our laws. And likewise, people who are coming into our country need to be people who can contribute. Thankfully, we are a country that's been made up of immigrants. I'm very, very thankful for that. It makes us great as a nation, the different perspectives and different cultures. That's a wonderful thing. But in all of that, we need to come together, to work together, to continue to build on the foundation of the greatest nation on earth. And this is a big step in that direction, and we're thankful for it. Also in the news, again, many of these headlines were buried underneath the bigger stories of the coronavirus and the democratic process, the process for the Democratic Party. It is a democratic process, but more specifically for the Democratic Party. Some of these were buried, and one of those was this, that New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan signed this week a series of red flag laws, red flag legislation into law. And then on the other side of that, told the sheriffs in her state, the state of New Mexico, that if they were unwilling to enforce these laws, that they should resign. This is an interesting part of the larger discussion in our country on gun control. Red flag laws, if you're not familiar, are those laws that would say something like this, and how exactly they're worded would be different from place to place and from law to law. But the idea is this: if someone who owns a gun is demonstrating behavior that would be considered dangerous or maybe unusual, that a citizen who sees that happening could call the government and raise the red flag. That they could say, that person, I know they own a gun, their behavior scares me, and since they have a gun, I want to let you know about that. And then the government could decide to come in and remove that person's gun, that person's firearms from their home until a panel of some kind meets and decides what to do next. This is a very interesting conversation, and one we'll have more in the future. What do you do with someone who has the means to hurt other people, but those means are a right ensured in our Constitution, but then they act in a way that may make us nervous? What do you do with that person? This is a huge conversation, and this is where the conversation around red flag laws really rests. What do you do? How do you deal with the conflict between the two? What's interesting on the one side is that if you live in a place where there are red flag laws, you can point a finger without any justification, without any evidence, and you can say, they scare me because of what they've said or what they've written even on social media, and the government then has the right, because a citizen has complained, to remove the firearms protected in the Constitution from that individual, even sometimes putting them in jail. This has happened recently, very recently in the last week or so in the state of Michigan. This happens. Now, the conflict with that is that law-abiding citizens would also like to see dangerous people not have the means to hurt other people. And so certainly there is a big conflict around these red flag laws, and each one is written a little bit differently and has different implications across the board, and certainly a lot to talk about and a lot to discuss, and many folks are trying to figure all of that out. But when the governor signed this into law, she then said to those sheriffs who disagree with the law that if they don't want to enforce it, they should resign. Here's what's happening in counties across the country, really. The politically motivated senior executives in counties and in states are issuing laws that violate the United States Constitution. This is a really important distinction here. They're saying the Constitution says one thing, but we believe something else. So we, as the executive of the state or the county, are overriding the U.S. Constitution and saying that now this is the law because we think it should be. And then they are requiring law enforcement professionals to do their bidding as the executive of the state or the county in violation of the United States Constitution. On the face of this conversation, it sounds like, of course, the sheriff should support the governor of their state. On the face, it sounds that way. But the conflict is this: when laws are put in place by governors, by those who are running counties, by those who are even in cities in some cases, when those folks are putting in place laws that violate the United States Constitution, should the sheriff, the chief law enforcement official in counties across the country, should those sheriffs support the United States Constitution, or should they support those who have been duly elected in their states or in their counties or in their cities, who are now pushing forward an agenda that is anti-Constitution? That's a big question, isn't it? It's one that certainly will make its way through the courts and is even now making its way through the courts. But the takeaway for me on this issue is this: we must hang on to the United States Constitution and be firmly committed to defending not only the values, but the liberties given to us as citizens in the context of that Constitution, that governing document. Again, there is a process ensconced in that document to change those liberties, to change those laws, to change those protections that are given if we want to change them. As a citizenship, we can rise up and we can vote and we can change what the Constitution says. But until we do, each government official, whether they be an executive or a law enforcement official, has not only the right, but the responsibility to enforce those laws. It's an interesting day and age in which we live. We live in a day and age, as I've illustrated through these news stories this week, that would say, well, the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that was from the Declaration, not the Constitution, but those rights protected in the Constitution, they don't matter if you don't fit our lifestyle or our agenda, if you fall into the category of folks who can be simply discarded or aborted. And the ramifications beyond that are immense. Well, if you are immigrating to our country and you don't fit the context, we don't have to follow the United States Constitution. As it relates to guns and other issues, we don't have to follow the United States Constitution. We can follow the whims of whoever happens to be in charge today. Here's the beauty of our system. The beauty of our system is that the whims of the individual who happens to be in charge today are not in place to dictate to the citizens what we should do, how we should live, and how we should behave. That's the beauty of the Constitution. It's the beauty of our system, and I'm thankful for it. Let's do our best as Americans to stand up for the liberties that we have been given, the liberties that have been fought for, the liberties that have been preserved, and the liberties that will carry us forward for generations to come. A lot of news this week. A lot of it gets buried beneath some of these bigger stories like the coronavirus and who's going to be the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. These are big stories, of course, but there's a lot of other things going on. Get beneath the headlines, figure it out, take some things away for yourself, and live your life. Appreciate you watching. Again, subscribe, like, hit that notification bell, share this information out, and have a great weekend.